Welcome to the A.Little.Mental podcast, the place where you can find credible information, resources, and community to help you reach wellness a little mental at a time. I'm your host and founder, Morgan Reed, and I'm so glad you're here. Let's get into it. Molly is a fourth-year doctoral student in clinical psychology at the Furkoff Graduate School of Psychology in New York City. In 2023, Molly received her master's in clinical psychology, and in 2020, she received a master's in counseling and mental health services from the University of Pennsylvania. She has worked at the Beck Institute for CBT, as well as the Aaron T. Beck Center for Psychopathology Research as Dr. Aaron Beck's personal research assistant. Molly's current research focuses on moral beliefs, motivations, and behaviors of domestic violence offenders and survivors. More broadly, Molly is interested in understanding and treating interpersonal trauma in psychotherapy and is passionate about challenges revolving around identity, sexuality, and relationships. Molly has completed advanced clinical externships at the Cooney Graduate Center, Student Counseling Services, Brooklyn VA Medical Center, and is currently working at the Zucker Hillside Hospital at an inpatient psychiatric unit for women. She has conducted over 500 hours of psychotherapy using CBT, psychodynamic, and trauma-informed interventions. And she has treated a range of mental health challenges, including depression, anxiety, body image and eating disorders, and PTSD. Molly has published numerous academic articles and has recently co-authored a textbook chapter with Dr. Aaron Beck on cognitive therapy and recovery-oriented approaches in mental health care. In her free time, Molly enjoys salsa dancing, cooking, and biking. So we are here today with my good friend, Molly. Molly, before we jump in and get into it, is there anything else that you want the listeners to know about you that may be relevant to our conversation today, or just more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Morgan. This is so nice to be in this virtual space with a friend and a colleague. I'm really happy to do this. I guess in terms of introducing myself, I would say that I'm a psychologist in training. I'm currently a fourth-year doctoral student in New York City. I'm so passionate about the work that I do. I primarily work with adults, and so I'm assuming that this conversation will largely center around what therapy looks like for an adult population, but there's plenty of resources out there for other age groups that I think are relevant. I think in terms of my passions and my interest, I'm really passionate about women's mental health, specifically relationships, intimacy, trauma, and sexuality. That's sort of my wheelhouse. I have a lot of extensive training with cognitive behavior therapy, but in general, I sort of like to identify as an integrative therapist. And so what that means for me is sort of taking ideas, taking interventions from different therapy orientations and using them in like a tailored way with each of my clients. So other than that, I would say I'm really working recently to create some sort of balance in my life other than being a psychologist. And right now that's looking like cooking a lot at home, dancing as much as I can, and spending time with my partner and my friends. That's like feeling really important to me right now. So
amazing. Yeah. I am so excited and grateful that you are here today. I can't wait for this conversation because, you hit a lot of different groups of situations, of life identities, of different things like that. And so kind of getting into my first question around why should someone go to therapy?
Yeah, it's a great question and a question that I have grappled with a lot, both as a mental health professional and also as someone who's experienced the other side of the couch, right, or the table as a client. When I was preparing for this podcast, I was thinking how do I approach this question? And I was kind of thinking at a very basic level, there's sort of three scenarios why someone would go to therapy. So one would be if they want to go to therapy, if they have a desire to go to therapy, right? And that could be to explore themselves, to get to know themselves better, to gain some kind of insight or new skills that they don't have. It could also be that they want to explore and sort of process previous experiences or relationships that they've had, sometimes sort of like difficult or traumatic experiences. So that's kind of like one realm, right? If someone's just genuinely curious and wanting to know more about themselves, I feel like the second category in my mind are people who feel like they need therapy, right? And so that could be a person who is experiencing a pretty, noticeable change in themselves from what we might think is like their baseline or their normal self. And so, for example, like if with something like depression, someone might notice like, I'm feeling really low right now. I'm having a lot of negative thoughts about myself. Maybe I find myself really like experiencing intense negative emotions like sadness and anger. Maybe my eating and my sleeping has changed. And these things don't feel good to me and they don't feel normal to me, right?
Yeah.
That might be a signal that someone needs to go to therapy to figure out like what's actually happening for me and how can I get back to my baseline,
Absolutely.
right? And I guess the third sort of category in my mind is people who are sort of forced or pushed to go to therapy by someone else or some institution, right? So, one example is like, my partner wants me to go to therapy. I don't think I want to go, but my partner is saying, if you don't go to therapy, I'm going to break up with you, right? And that might be a motivator, right? Or sort of on a more institutional level, like maybe I've been mandated to go to therapy by the court system, right? So there's all different scenarios where someone would find themselves in therapy. I'm assuming we'll probably talk more in this podcast about the first two, right? What it means to want to go to therapy and what it means to sort of need to go to therapy.
That was great. And it's very much on par with what I often tell people about like why you should go to therapy. It's like want, need, have to, like that sort of phase. And I definitely want to talk about the first two, but I think what you brought up around the partner is a really interesting piece that I feel like we don't necessarily name as much, but there is an aspect and dynamic sometimes to the therapeutic dynamic where like you were forced, whether, like you said, by the legal system or relationship to come here. And so there's a bit of resistance there. And I think even if you think that you want to come to therapy or you recognize even that those other two reasonings behind, you want to explore yourself versus you recognize some change in functionality, there can be some conscious or subconscious resistance to therapy. So as somebody who has worked with clients and as somebody who has, even been in, like you said, on the other side of the couch, how do you know, and is it necessary to know why somebody is coming to therapy and what their level of resistance is to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like you, as a mental health professional, you want to have a sense of why the person is there. And to be honest, like, from the therapist perspective, we might be seeing something like when we're meeting a patient for the first time or a client, we might be having our own perspective about what their primary reason is, right? Which actually might be or might not be different from what they think their reason is, right? So for example, someone might come in and say like, I'm having a lot of issues with my romantic partner, right? We're like not communicating well. I feel like there's a disconnect and I really want to process this, right? Yeah. But from the therapist perspective, like I might be gathering a lot of other information from the person and realizing like, yeah, this person is having challenges in the relationship, but what is that stemming from? For example, it might be stemming from depression or anxiety, or sort of in a different perspective, maybe their relationship challenges are stemming from previous relationship patterns that they've had. Yeah. Right. So it's important to sort of know why the person's coming into therapy. It's important for the person to have their own perspective on why they're coming in. Yeah. But sometimes that's not always aligned, right? Yeah. And I think part of the work is like getting on the same page with your client about what to work on. Yeah. And I know I think one of therapists' favorite phrases is "it depends." So I was naming that now. But when it comes to that meet in the middle of that shift of same level of awareness of why we're here and what we're working on,
how long can that take? Especially as somebody who may come in with one idea as to why they're there, they either may not feel like they're getting there, or they may feel like they're talking about something differently. Like you said, like, I came in here because I'm having a problem in my current relationship. What does a partner from 4 years ago have anything to do with that? Like, how long can that take? What is that process like
Yeah.
as a therapist?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like my answer is sort of a classic therapist answer of like, it depends, right? It depends on the person. It depends on the dynamic between yourself as the therapist and the client.
Mhm.
It depends on like what their goals are. Sometimes people have really big goals that aren't necessarily realistic to achieve in like a short period of time, right? And so
Mm.
part of the work at the beginning with a client is like explaining that to them. Like, for example, like, maybe a person comes in wanting sort of a quick fix,
Mhm.
and you're explaining to them like, yeah, I see that this goal is super important for you, and I think this might take a couple months for us to think about together and process. I mean, I'm going to normalize here in this space that like
Mhm.
people are in therapy for years oftentimes. That doesn't necessarily like mean that their problems are more serious or more severe, right? Like you can be kind of simultaneously working towards different goals across a long-term therapy, and that doesn't mean that anything is like wrong with you because you're staying in therapy longer,
Right.
right? So, and I think back to this idea of resistance,
Mm.
resistance comes in a lot of different forms, right? So, for example, someone may be resistant, like if they want sort of a quick fix,
Right.
someone might be resistant to staying in therapy for a longer time, right? Resistance can also look like avoidance, right? Coming into
Mm.
therapy and avoiding talking about vulnerable emotions or talking about traumatic experiences that they've had.
Mhm.
So you have to work through that kind of resistance too. And I think the other resistance that comes to mind that's really common is some kind of resistance in like the therapy relationship, right?
Yeah.
This can be related to personality. This can be related to attachment. Is there some kind of resistance in the way that I'm relating to my client or my client is relating to me that's making it challenging for us to move forward in therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of good points there. So I think, like you said, when it comes to walking through the therapeutic process, what you said is so important. Like, it's not always and most often not a quick fix, and it can be
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to name, like you said, that you may be resistant and avoidant of talking about the actual issue that you came there for. And you could spend years avoiding it. And I personally have done that. I've had my therapist for years, and
Yeah.
I went in for a very specific issue. Like, I was recommended to go to therapy for a very specific issue. I like maybe hinted at it at the first session, and then it took years for it to actually
Yeah.
come back up. And he was
Yeah.
like, that's why we started this whole thing. Like, we
Uh-huh.
worked on other things,
Yeah.
but he was like, can we walk this all the way back to why you didn't bring that in the first place? And I think that kind of brings it to another point around like, this is a partnership, like this is a relationship,
Very
and
much
you
so.
can only get as much as you put into it. Like, you're gonna get what you put into it. And so it kind of circles back to that. If you're ready for therapy, part of it is the investment of time, money, but
Yeah.
also effort, right? Like, you have to know, like, are you willing to face some of
Yeah.
the things that you've been avoiding, you haven't known how to articulate, that may make you feel the big emotions like sad, angry, upset, distant? Like, are you ready to address those things? It's a tough place to be because the therapist can only help you with what you present to them.
Yeah. And I think like these are great points, and something that's coming up for me hearing you say that is that different therapists are going to be more or less their sort of style
Mhm.
to push someone out or past that avoidance, right? It sounds like what you were just sharing about
Mhm.
yourself, like it was okay from your therapist perspective to talk about the other stuff.
Yeah.
It's possible that your therapist was thinking to themselves like, I know Morgan will get there, right? And like, I'm okay with waiting this out,
Yeah.
right? There's so many other things we can talk about that are meaningful and important.
Yeah.
There are other therapists that are going to sort of see that resistance, see that avoidance, and maybe challenge you a little bit more directly to face it, right?
Yeah.
And that could go well for a client. And sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes a client is like, I don't want to be pushed in that way, or I'm not ready or willing to be vulnerable right now.
Yeah.
But I still want to be here and like explore what it means to be a client in therapy.
No, that's such an important point. Like, I don't want to, like, it's naming that boundary.
Yeah.
And wanting to continue. But
Yep.
what do you feel like happens? And I'm curious if this is something that you faced yet in your experience where like you kind of meet a crossroads with your client where you're like, you're gonna have to address this, and they absolutely do not. And they either don't want to go further or they completely avoid. Like, what happens when you kind of meet that crossroads when you feel like there's kind of been a stall or such a conflict in your therapeutic relationship that you may not be able to move forward? And who's that on too? Like, who's that on? Is it on the client? Is it on the therapist? Like, who names it?
I think going back to your point, it is a partnership, right? So I don't think we can make the assumption that it's always on the therapist
Sure.
to push, to move forward, to express whatever stuckness is happening. Like, I think there should be some accountability from the client to be able to name that and notice that. But that's not always the case, right? So I think as the therapist, we have to be willing to communicate when we're feeling that stagnancy, that stuckness, and explore it. Ultimately, like, therapy is the client's process, right? It is a partnership, but the client needs to be on board for whatever work that we're doing, right? And if they're deciding like, I just can't get there right now, I can't unlock whatever vulnerability I need to do the deeper work.
Yeah.
That may actually be a signal to take a break from therapy. Or maybe there is something about this particular therapist that is getting in the way for them. For example, maybe like there's a certain identity that the therapist holds, and they feel like this isn't someone that can really understand my experience because we have different identities. Or maybe I don't like how they're approaching therapy with me, right? So it doesn't always mean like I need to take a break because I'm being resistant. It could mean I need to find another therapist. Or I think the third kind of option that comes to my mind is like thinking about therapy as non-linear. Oftentimes we think about therapy both from, we want to think about therapy as from our perspective as mental health professionals, as this linear path of helping a client work towards their goals.
Yeah.
And clients feel the same way. They most often expect and want to work towards their goals very steadily and easily. And I honestly think like in the majority of cases that I've worked with clients, there are these like fast moving periods in therapy where everything seems to have a lot of momentum around it and they're working hard. And then you can reach these like stuck points, these like periods of just like, I don't feel like much is happening, or I feel like there's some resistance to getting towards the next level for me.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to like really stick it out, honestly. Sometimes it's not a time to take a break or find a new therapist. It's a time to recognize like, okay, maybe this feels a little slower right now, but I can be hopeful that at some point it will get back to the momentum.
Yeah. And I think that, again, kind of empathizing with folks who don't have the advanced degrees that we have, which, to be clear, still only take you but so far, especially in your own personal relationship with your own therapist.
Totally.
That is so much to consider, and that is so much to think about.
Yeah.
Especially in a space that has a very intense dynamic and oftentimes a power dynamic. So what do you suggest for folks who are like, I honestly don't know what it is? Like, I don't know if it's me. Like, is it me? Is it my resistance to being cool with stability? Is it me not wanting to do the work? Where do they think that through?
Again, I think this is like the answer to these questions like can be really individualized for every person, right? Yeah. And I'm so glad that you brought up the power dynamic in the therapy relationship.
Yeah.
That is so incredibly important and present always, regardless of who the two people are.
Yeah.
I mean, I've actually done in my graduate program, I've done a lot of reflecting and thinking about how to approach the power dynamic. And I've had this kind of like desire to do my best to decrease the power dynamic.
Yeah.
But that's not always possible. And I had a supervisor of mine say, like, okay, well, like maybe the goal here is not to minimize the power dynamic, but maybe it's to own it and to normalize it and like figure out what that means for you to have this power.
Yeah.
Right? And so really happy that you named that about therapy, because that is very real.
Yeah.
But I think going back to your question about like, how do you know what's causing the stuckness for you as a client? Like, I think this is a time where if you feel comfortable, this is a time maybe to like talk to your loved ones, right? Like if there's friends, for example, that you really trust, I often think like, I'm thinking about myself from the client perspective. Like when I feel stuck in therapy as a client, I can turn to my best friend, right? Or to my mom. I have a very close relationship with my mom, and I'm talking about it. Like, why do I think this is happening? I'm brainstorming, right? But I also recognize like not everyone has those people.
Yeah.
Right? In fact, that's why people go to therapy sometimes.
Yeah.
Don't have those people.
Right.
I think in that case, like it's really a matter of, I think a couple of things. One is reflecting on your own time about why this seems to be happening for you. And that could be like journaling, for example, like just spending some time to think about what's happening for you in the therapy outside of the session. I feel like that is actually sort of underrated. And I think a lot of clients don't quite understand, and this is not their fault at all.
Yeah.
But I think some clients really don't understand that actually the majority of the work that's happening is actually happening between sessions, not in the session. Right? You can get a lot of good information when you're sitting with your therapist, but you're implementing the work, you're doing a lot of the self-work in between the sessions. So that's what I would say is like to really reflect.
Wow. No, I love that you mentioned, because I love a good practical moment. So, really giving people tools on like, how do I address this? How do I look at this if I can't potentially look at it with the therapist themselves? But I do want to circle back to the power dynamic bit at some point. But, you talked about journaling, you talked about talking to your support system. If you have one, if you have folks, and even if it's one or two people, like reflecting and kind of having them to use to vent, to try to figure some things out. The journaling bit, I think both of those are really important. And like what you named, which is some of the most important, if not the most important work, is the work that you do in between sessions.
Yeah.
And it is severely underrated, even before and after a session, right? Like almost in preparation of a session. Like, what do you want to talk about? What came up for you in a previous session? If you have just started therapy, what are your feelings going into that session? And then after the session, right? Like, how does that make you feel? What did you have to do to take care of yourself afterwards? Because what I often liken therapy to is a workout, right? Like therapy is an emotional workout.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, kind of like a physical workout, like sometimes you can go to the gym or go and get active and you feel great afterwards and you feel energized. And other times you're down and out. You have ice packs, you're taking Advil, like you're down for the count. And sometimes it takes a delay. For oftentimes you don't even feel sore after the first day. It's that second day that gets you. And so there's also that delay. And I think that a lot of times that isn't always emphasized and noted and validated when you're talking about the therapeutic work and the work that is, evaluating, processing, and reflecting on your life at an emotional level.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that workout metaphor is such a good one. And I think like, I really liked what you said about kind of the first day after the workout versus the second day versus the third. Like, as you get more distance from the session that you had with your therapist, every day could bring up new thoughts, and feelings,
Yeah.
right? Like, I really appreciate you saying that, because you may feel like deeply sad, for example, after a therapy session. Maybe that would lead to some avoidance, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to go back to therapy because I don't want to feel sad afterwards. So I think it's a good reminder that oftentimes we cycle through, as clients, we cycle through different emotions as a result of therapy. And we may not like be stuck in these like really difficult emotions as much as you would think, right? Because you're moving through them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one that's important, like you said, you're moving through certain emotions, right? And just because you feel those emotions when you go to therapy isn't necessarily a bad thing, whether you're in the session or in between sessions. But that actually kind of brings me to another question around when you start therapy, how do you determine how often you go? Because like you said, it can depend on why you're there. It can depend on your motivations. It can depend on your budget. But like how, maybe as a therapist, as a client, like how does that process happen? How does that decision happen?
Yeah. So I appreciate the fact that you're bringing up how many different variables come into play when you're making a decision like this, right?
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes it's like, it seems like it should be simple, right? Oh, maybe my therapist recommends that I go once a week. And so that's what I'm going to do. And sometimes it literally is that simple.
Right.
But a lot of times it's not. Like, for example, it can also depend on like the kind of therapy that the therapist is providing, right? So in some forms of therapy, the norm would be like 3 or 4 times a week, right? In a more sort of psychoanalytic approach.
Very intense.
Very intense.
Very intense.
and not typical, I would say, like for most people, right? And then, there are some people who there's some other kind of styles of therapy where the standard is like a once per week, 45-minute session, right? I also want to name that our field is shifting in terms of some of this because of virtual therapy, right? It's become more accessible and oftentimes can be more affordable.
Yeah.
And so that can make people more motivated to show up to therapy more frequently.
Sure.
Right? I think is a benefit of virtual therapy potentially.
Absolutely.
Right. And the accessibility of it. I think it really needs to be a discussion with your therapist, like sort of at the beginning of how often do you think I need to show up for this to be effective? I would say like a standard for kind of like private practice or community mental health outpatient clinics is like you start maybe with once a week, see how that's going. And then depending on how that's going for you, after a certain period of time, oftentimes you can move to once every other week or sort of more like a check-in once every month or once every few months if you feel like you've made a lot of progress towards your goal, right? Similarly, like you could start at once a week with your therapist and you might realize like that's not enough, right? I'm really suffering. And your therapist might recommend like, okay, like maybe we should do twice a week. So it can really depend on kind of like your level of functioning, what kind of mental health challenges you're actually dealing with. But I do appreciate you bringing up the financial aspect of this, right? Because, and this is just sort of my own experience recently, like I'm a doctoral student who is not working, right? I'm a full-time student. And I recently went through the process of trying to find a new therapist. And particularly in New York City, right? It's really hard to find a therapist that is like reasonably priced, particularly for a student who's not working, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I ended up doing is like I found a therapist that I liked after a lot of work, which I want to normalize. Like it's hard to
find a therapist. It's a lot of work.
A lot of work. And what ended up happening is like I shared with her, like, I can't afford to see you every single week. Do you think that it's okay? Right. I'm like collaborating with her.
Yes.
I'm saying, do you think it's okay to come to therapy every other week, given what I'm telling you is going on in my life? And in that situation, and she understood my financial like constraints, right?
Yes.
She said, yeah, I think that's fine for now, with the understanding that like therapy, so many things in therapy are fluid, right? Like we want things to be flexible and fluid, both from the client and the therapist perspective.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think that's so important. I think even you giving that line around, hey, this is what I'm thinking about due
Yeah.
to my financial situation and what I know of my personal situation and the reason why I'm
Yep.
coming to therapy. In your professional opinion,
Yep.
does that make sense? Because
Oh,
it, like you said, it one sets the standard that you recognize that this is supposed to be an ongoing process. And
right.
two, it also sets the boundary and expectation back on them, circling back kind of to the power dynamic of it is their responsibility to help you recognize if this is the right way for you to go. Because
Yes.
if they fully are aware of the fact that if you have to pay out of pocket costs of like $150 a session, and you're like, I can come see you like twice a month,
Huh?
maybe once a month, if we're
Yep.
being really honest. And they're
Yep.
like, okay, you're dealing with things that you should be seeing somebody 3 to 4 times a week. Here's some resources for the University Counseling Center where you might see a wonderful human like Molly, who is a doctoral student and well in their
Yeah.
programming, or here's somebody who can take your insurance, because that's another aspect that I don't want to get too into the nitty gritty.
Yep.
But you know,
Yep.
when Molly says that it takes a lot, it can it that I call it like the equalizer of like, it costs this much, but I have this much time on my schedule, but this is the person that I really vibe with, but like can be exhausting.
And it can be really hard to find. Like, I know this sounds kind of like corny, but it's real. Like, it can be hard to find the piece that
Yeah,
fits perfectly for all of your needs, right?
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think also going back to the power dynamic,
Mhm.
because it is so important.
Yeah,
I will say that, like, oftentimes I encourage clients to advocate for their needs as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
It would, but I also recognize that's not easy given the dynamics,
yeah.
right? And so, for example, like, if you find a therapist that you really like,
Mhm.
but they don't necessarily take your insurance or their fee is like way too high, I recommend clients to say, like, do you have any options that for like a low fee, right?
Mhm.
Or do you work on a sliding scale?
Amazing.
There's so many times where therapists, they won't necessarily advertise that, but they'll keep a few slots for
Mhm.
clients to be seen at a much lower cost
Yeah,
if you really are in financial need, right? But
absolutely.
advocating for yourself in general, I think, is helpful, and in the therapy space, like, just as helpful.
Yeah, and I think I want to hit a couple of points just to make them super clear. So when you
Yeah.
say sliding scale,
Huh?
you mean like there is a range of per session costs
Yeah.
that a therapist is willing to take for a client to come see them. So if, for example, like you said, and they don't always advertise it, but so that's, I love that you said ask, because you never know unless you ask. But if somebody advertises themselves as like, I'm like $200 a session, and you're like, love working with you, I can't afford that, is there any wiggle room there? They might say, I can do 100 or I can do 125, which is like them kind of adjusting it. So it's not always a negotiation per se, but there may be a more accessible option. But I would love it if we could, because I know we've named it a couple times, but also to be explicit around when we say power dynamic, could you go a little bit more into like what we mean by that? Because I know we've been
Yeah.
bouncing like power dynamic and we're kind of insinuating the therapist has power in a
Yeah.
situation where a client might not. And I would love it if you could kind of give your take on what do you mean when you say power dynamic?
I think that if you talk to different therapists from different styles of therapy, therapists who hold different personal identities, I think you'll get different responses to this question.
Sure.
I think on a very sort of fundamental, basic level, there is an assumption that I think most therapists understand, that this is a professional relationship, right? Where we are providing a service and the client is receiving a service.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're providing something that someone else needs, in and of itself puts us in a position of some power. And when we're talking about mental health, I think it's particularly stark. It's particularly important,
Yeah.
right? Because we are seeing clients in their most vulnerable, distressed, suffering,
Yeah.
really. And so they are often in like real need to receive care and help and support, right? And so like we need to take that seriously as therapists, to recognize that and to not abuse that ultimately.
Yeah.
Right. Like we need to recognize that like someone is coming to us for something and we really need to help them.
Yeah.
And be aware of that. I think the other part of it is really about intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
And not only am I holding sort of a professional role as a therapist that puts me in some position of power,
yeah,
but then that intersects with other things, right? It intersects with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity in unique ways that can create more or less power for the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important to keep in mind, like, do we hold privileged identities ourselves as therapists?
Yeah.
And what does that mean if we're working with a client who maybe has less privileged identities than us, right?
Absolutely.
Outside of just the power of being a therapist.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, you and I have had a lot of conversations about the effects of intersectionality and how that gets incorporated into the power dynamic that is that role of therapist. That role is, you're the expert of, again, we go through hundreds and thousands of hours of training, let alone experience and coursework to make us have the ability to help you piece through this very gray area we call life in the brain and how those things work together or how they don't always work. And the fact of the matter is, it absolutely can be affected. Unfortunately, it can be affected by the differences or similarities that you have in identity and, what that can look like, whether it's, you sitting across from someone who has a different gender identity, who has a different sexuality, who has a different ability, like physical or hidden ability altogether, that can absolutely play a role. And I think that's why I love that you keep naming that some of these answers or responses are so individual, because how that all stacks up for certain people across the couch there absolutely plays a role into the impact and effect of a therapeutic dynamic.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. These are things that can be communicated openly with your client too.
Can.
Like, I think as therapists, we often have these conversations with like our colleagues.
Yes.
Or with supervisors.
Yes.
Or with ourselves. But I'm advocating for having these kinds of conversations with our clients, right?
Absolutely.
Getting their feedback of like, do they sense these differences, right? What do these differences in identities actually mean for us if we're going to work together? Like, this is like super critical. And again, like I think it is a responsibility for the therapist to initiate some of these conversations, but I also am supporting clients who are willing to start those conversations too.
Yeah. And I think that, and I want to name explicitly that, because we won't get in too nitty gritty here, but I have later episodes that do get into the question, like, does my therapist have to look like me? Which kind of gets into those identities. Like, do they have to align? What happens when they don't? And what that can look like, again, with this power dynamic, but also normalizing the fact that therapy and psychology, at the end of the day, the origins of it came from cisgendered, heterosexual white men, right? And not every program, not every therapist is created equally. And you as the client, unfortunately, still have to have a level of awareness in that, again, when you sit in this power dynamic, it's supposed to be, and making that explicitly clear, it's supposed to be a safe space. You're supposed to feel comfortable. You're supposed to want to be vulnerable, to be able to show your emotions, to be able to express yourself. But if you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like your therapist aligns with you, or you feel judged, that's not how it should be. And that requires an action, that requires some reflection on your part to make sure that you are in a safe environment, because you're supposed to be. That's what therapy is supposed to be.
Absolutely. And there's also a responsibility for the therapist to be like ensuring that dynamic to the best of their abilities,
The
right?
best of their ability.
Like, maybe they're doing all they think they can do with their training and it's still not feeling safe.
Yeah.
That's normal. Like that's okay to recognize that as the client and move on from that dynamic. Like if this particular therapist is not working for you in terms of that safety, because I do think that like it's pretty impossible to do the work in therapy, quote unquote, the work, whatever those goals are for you, whatever you're trying to accomplish, if you don't have that base level of safety. And then I would go as far as to say like trust and some kind of like warm interpersonal connection.
Yeah. I'm curious, and I know we're kind of winding down here, but I'm curious as we think about like some of these questions that clients may have or have the ability to ask, because let's be clear, you are allowed to ask questions. As you start therapy, I think that, the beginning of therapy is oftentimes the most ideal place to ask as many questions, because once you get in and settle in, sometimes it feels harder to like take a pause and name something meta or, like about the relationship itself. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts, either in your experience as a client or a therapist, where somebody has come and asked you a question that you were like, that's a good question to ask at the beginning, that's helped kind of set the tone for your relationship, or that you wish a client would ask, or that you think is a good question to ask.
I tend to ask this question, and I'm curious in this moment of whether I ask this because I'm in the field of psychology. But I would encourage others to ask their therapist what their style is, what their approach is to therapy, right? And they may give you some kind of like 30-second elevator speech, right? But you get a lot of information in those 30 seconds. And you start to think to yourself as a client, like, do I vibe with this? Do I agree with what they're saying? Do I think I would enjoy working with someone who approaches my challenges like this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, so I think that's like a really helpful question to ask. I think one of the other questions that may be helpful to ask is like, okay, like I'm thinking about myself as a client. Okay, I think I have, for example, social anxiety. Like, what would be the first step for us if we work together?
Oh, I love that question.
Yeah, like where do we go from here, right? I've just told you, you probably completed some kind of initial appointment. I've told you my life story, right? I've given you so much information. Like, where do you think we should start?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I love both of those. I will say the second one I haven't thought of, in the sense, like you said, of just engaging, but that first one I have told people, just to name, like I have talked to people, and when I actually have a blog, there's like 12 questions to ask your therapist, right? And that's one of them. And I think, like you said, I think for us, it's like, which approach are you using, and what's your integration? And I know when we were learning about that, and I was like, okay, which one does my therapist use? Like, it's a guessing game, right? But for somebody who may not have, again, like the abundance of psychoeducational background, where it's like a fun game, and you're like, no, like, how are you approaching my problem? I think it tells you a lot about the type of therapist you have, because again, I think they should be, and I feel very strongly about this, about that your therapeutic process should be a learning process, not just necessarily about yourself, but about the therapeutic process. Like, you should be learning how therapy works through therapy and get a level of psychoeducation, right? So if, you were to go to someone and say like, hey, like, how do you engage with, what is your approach now that you have all this information? Like, what do you think your approach would be? It shouldn't be an issue to ask that question. Like, your therapist should want to be able to have that conversation. They should be able to explain it to you, and they shouldn't make you feel any sort of way about asking that question, because it's a very valid question. So making that clear, it's a very valid question. So I love that you named that. I love that you named that.
And I think when it comes to like different therapy styles or approaches or orientations, sometimes clients, and we all do this because we're humans, we Google stuff. We do a lot of web searching.
Yeah.
And we and we start maybe as a client, we have no real understanding of what the differences are between therapy approaches.
Yeah.
Start to like kind of rigidly attach and say like, oh, I have, social anxiety, so I need someone with extensive expertise in cognitive behavior therapy, right? That may very well be true for some people, right? And that could help you narrow your search, right? Like, I want to look for someone with a lot of experience with CBT. I will say though that part of of asking a therapist about their approach is less about what orientation they follow and more about how do they describe themselves as like a human in the room with you. Because honestly, for me, like I'm starting throughout my training, I'm starting to come back to a place of what we kind of call in the field our basic counseling skills, which is sort of like trust, empathy, reflective listening, understanding, genuineness. Those kind of basic identities that we strive for as therapists, like those are just as important.
Yes.
If not more important than someone who says, oh, I've had, 50 hours of training in cognitive behavior therapy.
Absolutely.
I just want to put that out there too, that like when you're talking to a new therapist, you're getting a sense of like, what are they valuing as a therapist?
Oh my God. I love that you name that and that they are named basic counseling skills. So if you're not feeling that, that is an issue. Like that is a actual fundamental issue, and that you are completely valid in that evaluation. But again, we chalk it up as the vibe sometimes. And so you're like, is it me? Is it weird? And so you keep going. But oftentimes it's like, no, if that person feels like they're not making you comfortable, that's a fundamental problem, because that is a core quality of quality therapy.
I agree.
And that kind of leads me to the second question that you named, which is like, how are we getting into it? And you kind of hinted at it before, where I'm like, we Google anything in half a second and TikTok comes up in a quarter of a second in the sense of social anxiety, ADHD. And so a lot of times we can come in thinking, I know this is what I have, so how are you going to address it? But it's almost like a twofold of, again, like recognizing, and this can vary, right, between therapists. We're going to walk out why you think you have social anxiety. Or maybe you just quite literally got diagnosed by a psychiatrist who oftentimes does diagnoses and says, I was just given this diagnosis. What does that first step look like? And I think that like you said, that question I love that question, because it helps you at so many levels and layers of like, again, can they tell you, like, can they articulate like a early onset treatment plan? Because again, fundamental, there is a plan there. Can you explain and differentiate between what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, what I've identified it as, and what it may technically be? And can you validate my experience? Which I think is ultimately the core of that question, right? Like, can you validate my experience? Because no matter what it is, it's what I'm experiencing. It's what I think I'm experiencing. And I need to know that you recognize that and that you're ready to help me.
Yeah. I mean, again, like so beautifully said. And I think it's about validating someone's experience, but I also think it's about how accurately and deeply are you understanding it? A lot of people can validate a lot of things, and our friends also validate us, right?
Absolutely.
So as a psychologist or as a mental health professional, we need to go like beyond kind of simple validation, right? We need to actually be able to reflect back to them in a way that makes them feel deeply understood in addition to validated.
Absolutely.
The other thing that came to mind for me in terms of questions, because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, like your initial question of like, well, what should be asked? What should be asked of a therapist, right? I think the other thing that I would encourage or plug is for therapists, actually, for mental health professionals, to ask our clients, particularly in the first phase of building a relationship or starting therapy, do you have any other questions? Asking our clients if they have questions, because to be honest, a lot of times clients are pretty overwhelmed. They've just gotten a lot of information.
Yeah.
And or they don't feel comfortable just asking you a question without being prompted. And
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many times I've said to someone at the end of a session, like, do you have any other questions for me? Like, is anything else coming up that we haven't addressed? And something like super meaningful and super rich comes out of that. So I think
Mm.
that's another thing that I would say.
Yeah, I love that you name that too. Like you said, it goes back to the power dynamic. It goes back to understanding basic counseling skills. It goes back to empathizing with the fact that, you take it back to like school setting, like you might have questions, but as much as it could be a beautiful safe space for you, but at the end of the day, asking a question is still kind of you're not always sure if you can or if
Hopefully.
there's a space for it to happen
Yeah.
or to not know.
Right. I'm thinking about like the kid in the classroom who like in their mind like has so much to say and has so many questions but is like fearful or shy of raising their hand, right?
Absolutely.
Like that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's a new relationship that you're forming in therapy
Yeah.
and like it can be scary and overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like you said, naming that again, putting it back on the therapist to open up the door while also empowering clients to be like, you are allowed to ask questions at
Yes.
any point in time. You can ask it at
Yeah.
the beginning of your relationship. You can ask it in the middle of a session 2 years later. You're allowed to ask questions about the dynamic, about what you're doing during the dynamic, if there should still be a dynamic,
Yeah.
and be able to name that.
I love that you said that. And I guess the last thing that comes to mind for me about this is like I think we have to remember as mental health professionals that we are serving our clients.
Yes.
It is a relationship where both people are benefiting in some way, oftentimes,
Mm-hmm.
but our clients are like, they really need to be at the center of the experience,
Yes.
not just because they like are the client. And we often like shy away from these conversations in the field of psychology, but like this is also a business and
Yes.
this is a service again that we are providing. And like if they're not getting what they want or what they deserve, that is a problem. Like that is
Yes.
a problem ultimately.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. I
Yeah.
love that you named that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you feel like listeners should know about when considering going to therapy, whether they should, whether they shouldn't, or one piece, if they took away nothing else but this one piece of advice or information, like what do you feel like that would be? And I know that's a very hard question.
Well, so one of the things that like when I was prepping
Mhm.
for this podcast, like one of the things I was thinking about was, and we had a previous conversation about like, what does it mean to like try again after you have a negative experience with a therapist?
Beautiful. Yes.
And I just think it's so important to normalize that most people don't just have one therapist throughout their life. There's like this phrase that we use a lot in therapy of like basically finding a therapist is like shoe shopping. And it's sort of going back to the puzzle idea too of like
Yeah.
hard to find the perfect shoe or the perfect puzzle piece. Like it's a lot of work. And so I think one of the things that I would want to say at the end of this is that it's like I think clients deserve a lot of credit for
Yeah.
even getting to the therapy space. Before they even come to our offices, they've done like an immense amount of work to get there, right?
Yes.
But even with that said, I think it's okay for clients to intuitively, like, I think the main thing that I would want clients to take away from this, if they're listening, is like, it's okay to check in with what the vibe is. It's okay to listen to your intuition. It's also okay to advocate for yourself and ask questions of your therapist, right?
Mm.
And ultimately, all of that is okay because you're either working to strengthen the relationship that you have with your current therapist, or you're like, you're checking in with yourself because maybe it doesn't feel right. And it's also okay. And it's not a problem. It's not on you that a particular therapist isn't serving you, right? And I
Mm.
want clients to be hopeful that they can find someone else, right? I think that
Yeah.
feels really important.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that hope that it's not the end all be all.
Yeah.
But that being said, it does take work. I love the shoe shopping. I love the shoe shopping analogy. It's absolutely like that. And I sometimes liken it to like a dating analogy of like sometimes you'll find your person and sometimes you'll find your person for that time. And sometimes you'll go on a first date and never want to see that person again. And sometimes you need to take a break from dating altogether to get yourself to the place where you can put yourself back out there and put yourself in that vulnerable space. But I love the shoe shopping analogy because it's not always that you're not always going to find that perfect fit, or sometimes you just find a really solid pair. But either way, it's a process and it's a continuous process of evaluation and recognition that it's normal.
Absolutely. And I think like in my experience as a client with different therapists, I've worked with many different therapists, and what I think is interesting is like, I don't think any of these therapists are perfect for me. But every single experience I've had in therapy, I've gotten what I call like nuggets. There are important pieces or learning or new insights that have come out of that experience that make it worth it for me to keep trying to be a client and therapist in therapy, like even if it's not wholeheartedly perfect. Right. Like, I urge clients to like hold on to those nuggets that they get, right? Because they often come even if the therapy isn't totally perfect.
Beautiful. Molly, thank you so much. I think that's the best place to end off on. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you all want to learn more about Molly, you can check out the show notes. We'll have some stuff for you there. If you want to learn more about finding a therapist, about what to do when you find a therapist, you can go to our website, A.Little.Mental.org, and you can follow us on our socials, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook at A.Little.Mental. Have a great day, and don't forget to be kind to yourself today. Thanks for getting a little mental with me today. If you would like to find more resources, visit A.Little.Mental.org, and remember, be kind to yourself today.